The moment you realize your marriage is over isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as a single message glowing on a shared screen. That's how it started for me. A Saturday morning, a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and a notification that wasn't meant for my eyes. David and I had shared the same tablet for years. Grocery lists, travel confirmations, family photos. Nothing secret ever lived on that device. At least that's what I believed. Until the message appeared. Same place Saturday. I'll get there before sunset. It was signed with a small red heart and the name Samantha. At first I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe a colleague, maybe a work message taken out of context. But something about the casual confidence of that line made my stomach tighten. I didn't rush to conclusions. After 23 years of marriage, you learn that panic solves nothing. Instead, I read the message again, slowly. Same place Saturday. The words echoed in my head because there was only one same place David ever mentioned when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Our beach house. The one on the Outer Banks. The house with pale blue shutters and a wide porch that faced the Atlantic, where the wind carried the smell of salt and sea grass through every open window. David loved that house, or at least he loved telling people it was ours. What he never seemed to remember was that I had purchased it long before he ever suggested we spend summers there. My mother left me a modest inheritance when she passed away, and instead of investing it in something complicated, I bought a place that felt peaceful. A place where the ocean stretched for miles and the nights were quiet except for the waves. David always referred to it as our escape, but legally and financially, it had always been mine. Still, none of that explained Samantha. I set the tablet down and walked to the kitchen window, watching a pair of sparrows hop along the fence in our backyard. I told myself there could be a reasonable explanation. But curiosity has a way of pushing you forward whether you want it to or not. So I picked the tablet back up and looked again. There were more messages. Nothing graphic, nothing that would violate anyone's sense of decency, but enough warmth and familiarity to make the truth impossible to ignore. Plans about meeting. Mentions of the ocean. Little jokes that suggested they'd shared moments together before. My heart didn't race. That's the strange part people don't tell you. When betrayal becomes real, it can feel less like an explosion and more like the quiet settling of dust after something breaks. I scrolled until I saw a photo. Not inappropriate, just two smiling faces at what looked like a restaurant patio somewhere sunny. David on one side, a woman with dark hair and a bright, confident smile on the other. Samantha Reed, according to the contact name. I stared at her face for a long moment. She looked younger than me, maybe mid-30s, the kind of woman who seemed comfortable in every picture. I wasn't angry yet. Mostly I was curious. Curious about how long this had been happening, curious about how careless David had become, and curious about why he thought the beach house was the perfect place for something like this. He must have believed I'd never find out. That thought alone told me a lot about the distance that had quietly grown between us. I closed the message thread and set the tablet down again. If David was planning to go to the beach house Saturday, that meant he believed he had the weekend to himself. Conveniently, he had mentioned a business trip earlier that week. Chicago, he said. 2 nights. Meetings with a client. At the time I had nodded and wished him a good flight. Now the story felt almost predictable. I walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa, letting the sunlight spill across the hardwood floor. 23 years of marriage is a long time to summarize in a single moment, but that message had done exactly that. Instead of shouting or confronting him immediately, I did something else. I opened my laptop and searched for Samantha Reed. It took less than 5 minutes to find her. Social media can be surprisingly generous with information if you know where to look. There she was again, the same smile from the photo. A marketing consultant from Raleigh. Stylish, confident, always photographed with friends at rooftop restaurants or weekend events. But the detail that made me pause was the man standing beside her in several pictures. Tall, sandy hair beginning to gray at the temples, wearing a wedding band in every shot. The caption on one photo read, "Anniversary dinner with my favorite person." His name was Michael Reed, her husband. For a moment, I simply looked at the screen, absorbing the strange symmetry of it all. 2 marriages quietly unraveling in parallel. 2 people completely unaware of what their partners were planning for Saturday. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. Some people might have closed the laptop and tried to forget everything. Others might have started a fight the moment their spouse walked through the door. But something inside me preferred clarity. If David wanted to take his mistress to the beach house, then maybe the beach house was exactly where the truth needed to appear. I looked again at the message. Same place Saturday. I'll get there before sunset. Outside the window, the afternoon light shifted across the yard, and for the first time since reading those words, a small, calm idea formed in my mind. If David believed that house was the perfect place for secrets, then perhaps Saturday would be the day those secrets stopped being hidden. By the time Thursday morning arrived, the house felt exactly the same as it always had, but I was not the same woman moving through it. The sunlight still filtered through the kitchen blinds. The coffee maker still hummed softly on the counter, and David still kissed my cheek before leaving for work as if nothing in the world had changed. If he noticed anything different about me, he did not say so. That was the strange thing about secrets. The person holding one believes they are the only one who knows it exists. David left the house around 8:30 that morning, grabbing his briefcase and mentioning his supposed trip to Chicago again, the same story he had repeated earlier in the week. He spoke about meetings and flights and hotel reservations with the comfortable rhythm of someone who believed his version of reality would not be questioned. I smiled politely and wished him a safe trip. When the front door closed behind him, the quiet that followed felt heavier than usual. I walked back to the dining table where my laptop was still open from the night before. Samantha Reed's social media page remained on the screen. Her life looked polished and carefully arranged, the kind of life people enjoy presenting online. Pictures from charity events, brunch with friends, a smiling photo with her husband Michael standing beside a sailboat at what looked like a marina somewhere along the coast. I studied his face for a long moment. There was something calm and steady about him, the kind of expression that suggested he trusted the world around him. That trust made the situation feel even more unfair. If the roles had been reversed, I would have wanted to know. The thought settled quietly in my mind until it became impossible to ignore. I clicked on Michael Reed's profile. Unlike Samantha, he did not share much. A few professional photos connected to his work as a financial consultant, a family photo from a holiday gathering, and a picture of the same beach house skyline I recognized from the Outer Banks. Apparently, he loved the ocean too. I hesitated for several minutes with my hands resting on the keyboard. Reaching out to a stranger about something like this was not simple. It meant changing the course of 4 lives in a matter of minutes. But avoiding the truth would not make it disappear. Finally, I found a professional email address listed on his business page. It was straightforward, the kind of contact information someone expected clients to use. I opened a new message and stared at the blank space for a while. There was no graceful way to begin a conversation like this. Eventually, I typed slowly, choosing each word carefully so nothing sounded dramatic or exaggerated. I introduced myself and explained that I believed our spouses might be involved in something they had not told us about. I mentioned the message I had seen and the plan to meet at a beach house on Saturday evening. I made it clear that I was not accusing him of anything, only sharing information that I would want someone to share with me if the situation were reversed. Before sending the message, I read it 3 times to make sure the tone was calm and respectful. Then I pressed send and closed the laptop. The rest of the day moved slowly. I went through ordinary routines like grocery shopping and answering a few emails for my own consulting work, but my mind kept drifting back to the message I had sent. By late afternoon, I began to wonder if Michael would even respond. Perhaps he would think it was a mistake, or worse, assume it was some kind of misunderstanding. Around 6:30 that evening, while I was rinsing dishes at the kitchen sink, my phone buzzed softly on the counter. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I dried my hands and answered. The voice on the other end was calm, but cautious. He introduced himself as Michael Reed. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke beyond polite greetings. Finally, he said he had received my email and asked if we could talk through the situation directly. I explained again what I had seen on the tablet and repeated the message about Saturday at the beach house. When I finished speaking, there was a long pause on the line. I could hear him breathing slowly, the way people do when they are trying to process something unexpected. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded steadier than I expected. He said he appreciated my honesty and that he had always believed Samantha traveled frequently for work on weekends. Hearing the details laid out this way clearly forced him to reconsider that assumption. Neither of us raised our voices. There was no anger in the conversation, Only the careful exchange of facts between two people who had just discovered their lives might not be as stable as they believed. After nearly 20 minutes of talking, Michael asked one question that stayed with me long after the call ended. He asked if I was certain about the location. I told him yes. The message specifically mentioned the beach house and arriving before sunset. Another pause followed. Then he said quietly that he would like to know the truth for himself, not through rumors or secondhand information, but by seeing it with his own eyes. His tone was not emotional. It sounded more like someone deciding to finish a difficult task that could not be postponed any longer. I understood exactly what he meant because I felt the same way. That was the moment when a simple phone call turned into the beginning of a plan neither of us had imagined 24 hours earlier. Saturday evening was still 2 days away, and somewhere out there David and Samantha were probably looking forward to a quiet weekend by the ocean, completely unaware that the people they had betrayed were now talking calmly about what would happen when they arrived at the house they believed was empty. After my phone call with Michael ended, the quiet inside the house felt different from before. It was no longer the heavy silence of confusion, but the steady calm that comes when a difficult truth has finally stepped into the open. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, looking through the window at the late evening sky, turning a pale shade of orange above the neighborhood rooftops. Somewhere out there David was probably finishing his workday, confident that his weekend story about Chicago was already accepted. The thought was strangely distant now. What mattered was Saturday. Michael had asked if we could speak again the following day after he had time to think. I told him that would be fine. The plan, if it could even be called a plan yet, needed to be thoughtful and calm. The goal was not confrontation or chaos. The goal was clarity. Friday afternoon arrived with an unexpected sense of focus. Around 2 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time I recognized the number immediately. Michael's voice sounded steadier than the night before, as if he had spent the last 24 hours carefully organizing his thoughts. He said he had reviewed Samantha's recent travel claims and compared them with the timeline I had mentioned. The overlap was impossible to ignore. According to him, Samantha had told him she would be attending a marketing conference in Wilmington on Saturday evening. That city was nearly 100 miles from the beach house on the Outer Banks. The difference between the two locations left little room for misunderstanding. Neither of us sounded surprised anymore. Instead, we spoke with the calm tone of two people who had quietly accepted the same uncomfortable reality. After a few minutes of conversation, Michael asked a question that shifted everything forward. He asked what I intended to do when Saturday arrived. I told him honestly that I had considered several options, but the one that made the most sense was the simplest one. If David and Samantha believed the beach house was empty, then perhaps it should not be. There was a brief silence on the line before Michael responded with a thoughtful breath. He said he had been considering the same idea, not as revenge, not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a way to remove every possible doubt. Seeing something with your own eyes is very different from hearing about it secondhand. We talked through the details slowly, making sure everything stayed respectful and controlled. The beach house was about 4 hours from where I lived, depending on traffic along the coastal highway. Michael said he could arrive around mid-afternoon if he left early from Raleigh. I told him I would drive down that morning and open the house before he arrived. The timing mattered because the message I had seen said David planned to arrive before sunset. In early autumn along the Outer Banks, sunset came a little after 6:30 in the evening. That gave us plenty of time to settle inside before they arrived. As we discussed the plan, I realized something interesting about Michael. He was not angry in the way many people might expect. His voice carried a quiet disappointment instead, the kind that comes when someone realizes the person they trusted most has been living a different story. I understood that feeling well. By the end of our call, the plan was simple. We would both be at the beach house on Saturday evening. No shouting, no accusations shouted across a room. Just presence. The truth would reveal itself without needing much help from either of us. When the call ended, I walked upstairs and opened the closet where I kept a small travel bag. Packing for the beach house felt almost surreal. Normally, that place was associated with summer mornings, long walks on the sand, and the gentle rhythm of waves rolling toward shore. Now it was becoming the setting for something entirely different. I placed a few clothes in the bag, along with a light sweater because the ocean breeze could become cool after sunset. Before closing the zipper, I paused and added one more item, the set of house keys that had always belonged to me. Later that evening, David returned home carrying his briefcase and talking about airport schedules. He mentioned his flight leaving early Saturday morning and asked if I could water the plants while he was away. I listened patiently, responding with small nods and polite answers. If he noticed the quiet change in my expression, he did not mention it. After dinner, he spent nearly an hour on his phone in the living room, occasionally smiling at something on the screen. I did not ask what he was reading. Instead, I washed the dishes and looked at the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. Saturday was now circled in my mind in a way it had never been before. The following morning arrived with cool coastal air drifting through the neighborhood streets. David left early, carrying a small suitcase and repeating his story about Chicago one more time before heading toward the airport. I watched his car disappear down the road and waited a few minutes before stepping back inside the house. Then I picked up my travel bag, locked the front door, and walked toward my own car parked in the driveway. The drive to the Outer Banks would take about 4 hours, stretching along highways that gradually turned into narrow coastal roads lined with tall grasses and wooden bridges over quiet water channels. As the miles passed beneath the tires, I felt an unusual sense of calm growing stronger. The truth was already in motion now. Somewhere behind me, David believed he was flying toward Chicago, and somewhere west of the coast, Michael Reed was probably preparing for the same journey I was making. By the time the ocean finally appeared on the horizon, glowing silver under the afternoon sun, I knew that the quiet little beach house waiting beyond the dunes was about to witness a moment none of us would forget. The road leading into the Outer Banks always had a way of slowing time. As the highway narrowed into a 2-lane coastal road, the landscape changed from busy towns to wide stretches of marsh grass and quiet water reflecting the afternoon sun. I had made this drive dozens of times over the years, usually with music playing and David talking beside me about weekend plans or seafood restaurants along the coast. Today the passenger seat was empty, and the silence inside the car felt steady rather than lonely. The ocean breeze carried a faint smell of salt through the cracked window, and the rhythmic sound of tires rolling across the long bridge toward the barrier islands filled the quiet space. By the time I reached the small road that led toward the beach house, the sun was already beginning its slow descent across the sky. The house stood exactly as I remembered it, pale blue shutters framing the windows and a wooden staircase rising toward the wide porch that faced the ocean. Sea grass moved gently in the wind along the sandy path leading up to the front steps. For a moment, I simply sat in the car and looked at it. When I first bought this place, I had imagined it as a refuge from complicated moments in life. I had never imagined it would become the setting for one of them. I stepped out of the car and walked up the steps, the wood creaking softly beneath my shoes the same way it always had. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door opened to the familiar scent of clean wood and ocean air. Inside, the living room looked exactly as it had during our last visit that summer. Sunlight poured through the large windows facing the water, casting long golden reflections across the hardwood floor. The sofa sat in its usual place near the window, and the small bookshelf beside it still held the same collection of novels I had left behind months earlier. I placed my travel bag near the staircase and walked through each room slowly, opening windows to let the fresh ocean air circulate through the house. The breeze carried the steady sound of waves rolling onto the beach just beyond the dunes. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to simply stand on the back porch and watch the water stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The calmness of the scene made it almost difficult to believe what the evening might bring. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Michael saying he had just crossed the last bridge onto the island and would arrive within 30 minutes. I replied with the address and told him the front gate would be open. When his car finally pulled into the sandy driveway a short while later, I walked down the porch steps to meet him. Michael Reed looked much the same as he had in the photographs I had seen online. Tall, thoughtful, and carrying the composed expression of someone who had spent the entire drive reflecting on the situation ahead. He stepped out of his car and offered a polite handshake, the kind two strangers might exchange when meeting for the first time at a business appointment rather than a moment like this. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The ocean wind moved quietly through the grass around the driveway while the house stood behind us in the afternoon light. Finally, he thanked me for reaching out earlier in the week and said that although the circumstances were difficult, he appreciated knowing the truth. I nodded and told him I felt the same way. We walked up to the porch together and stepped inside the house. Michael looked around the living room with a thoughtful expression, taking in the view of the ocean through the large windows and the simple furniture arranged across the room. He mentioned that he had visited the Outer Banks once years ago for a fishing trip, but he had never seen this particular stretch of coastline. I told him the beach was usually very quiet this time of year, especially on weekends after the summer season ended. The peacefulness of the place made the conversation feel almost surreal. After a few minutes, we sat down across from each other in the living room, the soft sound of waves rolling in the distance through the open windows. We spoke calmly about what might happen when David and Samantha arrived later that evening. There was no need for complicated strategies. The situation itself would reveal everything clearly enough. Michael said he did not want shouting or accusations. He simply wanted to see the truth for himself and allow each person to face the reality of their choices. I agreed completely. As the afternoon slowly moved toward evening, the sunlight outside shifted from bright gold to the softer tones of approaching sunset. Around 6 o'clock, the sky above the ocean began to glow with shades of orange and pink spreading across the horizon. From the porch, we could see the long stretch of empty beach below the dunes, untouched except for the steady line of waves reaching the shore. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost ironic given what we were waiting for. Michael stood beside the porch railing looking out toward the water while I checked the time on my phone. According to the message I had read days earlier, David planned to arrive before sunset. That meant it would not be long now. As the light began to fade across the sky, the distant sound of a car engine slowly approached along the sandy road leading toward the house. Michael and I exchanged a brief glance before stepping quietly back inside the living room. Through the front windows, we could see the headlights turning into the driveway. 2 figures stepped out of the vehicle, laughing softly as they walked toward the front porch, completely unaware that the quiet beach house they believed was empty was already waiting for them. The sound of the car door closing outside carried clearly through the quiet evening air, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps on the sandy driveway as David and Samantha walked toward the porch. Inside the living room, Michael and I stood a few feet apart near the large window facing the ocean, neither of us speaking as the moment we had been preparing for quietly arrived. Through the glass, we could see their silhouettes moving up the wooden steps. Samantha laughed softly at something David said, the relaxed sound of someone who believed the evening ahead would be simple and private. David reached into his pocket for the key he thought would unlock an empty house. He still believed this place belonged to both of us, a shared escape where no one would question why he had come here on a weekend he claimed to be in Chicago. The key turned in the lock and the front door slowly opened. The warm glow of sunset light filled the entryway as they stepped inside together. At first they did not notice us. Their attention was on each other and the familiar comfort of the room. Samantha glanced around the living space with a small smile as if appreciating the view she had heard about but perhaps never seen before. David placed a small travel bag near the door and began speaking about the ocean breeze coming through the windows, completely unaware that the quiet room was no longer empty. It took only a few seconds for reality to catch up with them. Samantha's eyes moved across the living room and suddenly stopped when she noticed 2 figures standing near the window. Her expression shifted instantly from relaxed curiosity to complete confusion. David followed her gaze, and the moment he recognized me standing there, his entire posture froze. For a long second no one spoke. The sound of the ocean outside continued its steady rhythm as the last sunlight of the day stretched across the hardwood floor between us. David looked as though he had forgotten how to form words. His eyes moved from my face to Michael standing calmly beside me, and then back again as if his mind could not quite assemble the pieces of what he was seeing. Samantha's reaction was quieter, but just as stunned. She stared at Michael with the unmistakable recognition of someone who had not expected to see her husband standing in a beach house hundreds of miles from the place she claimed to be traveling that weekend. The silence that followed felt almost unreal in its calmness. There was no shouting and no dramatic gestures. Instead, there was only the unmistakable weight of truth settling into the room. David finally managed to speak, his voice uncertain as he tried to construct a sentence that might explain the impossible scene in front of him. He asked what we were doing there, as if the answer might somehow rearrange the situation into something less obvious. I looked at him steadily, and explained in a calm voice that I had decided to spend the weekend at the beach house. After all, it was a beautiful evening, and the ocean air had always been refreshing this time of year. My tone remained even, not angry, not sarcastic, simply factual. David opened his mouth as if to continue the conversation, but no explanation seemed ready. Samantha shifted her weight slightly and looked toward Michael, who had remained completely composed throughout the entire moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same steady calm that had defined every conversation we had shared so far. He asked Samantha a simple question about her conference in Wilmington and whether the ocean view in this house looked anything like the meeting rooms she had described earlier that week. The question hung in the air without accusation, but its meaning was impossible to ignore. Samantha looked down briefly before lifting her eyes again, clearly aware that the situation had moved far beyond the point of simple misunderstandings. David took a small step forward as if hoping to control the direction of the conversation, but even he seemed to recognize that control had quietly slipped away the moment the door opened. I walked toward the center of the living room so that all four of us stood within the soft light fading through the windows. The ocean behind us reflected the final colors of sunset, turning the water into a calm mirror of orange and deep blue. For years this house had represented peace to me, and strangely enough it still did. The difference was that the truth now existed openly within its walls. David tried again to speak, this time asking when I had arrived, and why I had not mentioned my plans earlier in the week. I explained that sometimes surprises reveal more honesty than long conversations ever could. Michael nodded slightly beside me, understanding exactly what I meant. The quiet confidence of the moment made it impossible for anyone to pretend confusion any longer. Outside, the sun finally slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the living room lit only by the soft glow of evening light drifting through the open windows. David looked from me to Michael once more as the reality of the situation settled completely into place. For the first time since walking through the door, he seemed to understand that the evening he had planned so carefully had already turned into something very different from what he expected. For several seconds after the door closed behind them, the living room remained completely still except for the sound of waves rolling toward the shore outside the open windows. David stood near the entryway with the expression of someone who had stepped into the wrong scene of a story he did not understand. Samantha remained beside him, her eyes shifting slowly between Michael and me as if she were searching for a version of reality that made sense. No one raised their voice. The calmness in the room was almost heavier than anger would have been. Finally, David cleared his throat and tried again to speak, this time forcing a small, uncertain laugh that sounded completely out of place. He said there must be some kind of misunderstanding and that he had not expected anyone to be here this weekend. His words drifted across the room without conviction. I watched him carefully, noticing how his eyes avoided meeting mine for more than a second at a time. For 23 years, I had known the small details of his behavior when he felt confident, when he felt nervous, and when he was trying to construct a story that had not yet been fully formed. Tonight, he looked like a man whose carefully prepared explanation had disappeared the moment he opened the front door. Michael remained composed beside the window, his posture relaxed but steady as he observed the scene unfolding. When he finally spoke again, his tone remained calm and measured. He addressed Samantha directly and asked if she would like to explain how a marketing conference in Wilmington had somehow brought her to a beach house on the Outer Banks with another man. The question was simple, almost polite, but the meaning behind it left no room for confusion. Samantha looked toward David briefly before answering, as if hoping he might provide a response for both of them. When none came, she exhaled slowly and admitted that the situation was clearly not what she had described earlier in the week. Her voice was quiet, lacking the confident energy that appeared in her photographs online. David shifted his weight and finally looked directly at me. He asked how long I had known and why I had decided to come here instead of speaking with him at home. I considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. I explained that sometimes people reveal more about themselves when they believe no one is watching. By the time I finished speaking, the last colors of sunset had faded from the sky, and the room had grown dim except for the soft evening light drifting through the windows. David walked slowly toward the center of the living room, as if trying to regain some sense of control over the situation. He said that whatever Michael and I believed was happening, the story was not as simple as it appeared. It was the type of sentence people use when they are searching for time to organize their thoughts. Michael listened quietly and then asked another calm question. He asked whether David would like to explain the message about arriving before sunset and the plan to spend the weekend here. David hesitated again, clearly aware that every explanation he considered would only lead back to the same undeniable reality. For a moment the room fell silent once more. The quiet sound of ocean waves moved through the open windows, while the evening air carried the faint scent of salt and sea grass. Finally Samantha spoke again, this time looking toward Michael with an expression that mixed regret and exhaustion. She said she had not expected things to unfold this way, and that she understood why he had come to see the truth for himself. Michael nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement without raising his voice or expressing anger. His calm reaction seemed to make the situation even more uncomfortable for David, who now looked from one person to another as though searching for a way to change the direction of the evening. I stepped closer to the window and turned on a small lamp beside the sofa, allowing a warm light to fill the room. The simple action felt symbolic in a quiet way. For days this moment had existed in the shadows of hidden messages and half-spoken plans. Now everything was clearly visible. David noticed the movement and asked whether I had been planning this entire situation from the moment I discovered the messages. I told him that planning was not the right word. The truth simply had a way of finding its way into the open when people decided to stop pretending it was not there. Samantha lowered her eyes again, while Michael remained thoughtful beside the window. After a few more moments, David finally seemed to recognize that the conversation could not be redirected into a comfortable explanation. He looked around the room slowly, taking in the familiar furniture and the view of the ocean beyond the glass. The place he had chosen as a quiet escape now held 4 people who all understood exactly why they were standing there. The realization appeared to settle heavily on his shoulders. Outside the night had fully arrived, and the steady rhythm of waves continued rolling toward the shore as the 4 of us stood in the living room of the beach house, where secrets had quietly come to an end. The quiet inside the beach house deepened as the reality of the evening settled over all 4 of us. No one moved for several seconds, and the only sound in the room remained the steady rhythm of the ocean outside the windows. David stood near the center of the living room with his hands resting awkwardly at his sides, as if he still hoped the situation might somehow rearrange itself into something less obvious. Samantha remained closer to the door, her posture tense, her attention shifting between Michael and me as though she were measuring every possible reaction we might have. Michael, however, had not changed his position near the window. He looked calm, almost thoughtful, the way someone might appear when they finally understand a complicated puzzle that had been forming quietly in the background of their life. I walked slowly toward the sofa and sat down, giving the moment room to breathe rather than forcing it into a confrontation. The small lamp beside me cast a warm circle of light across the room, softening the shadows that had formed after sunset. David noticed the movement and turned slightly toward me, clearly uncertain whether he should continue speaking or simply wait. After a moment he chose to speak again, though this time his voice carried less confidence than before. He said that whatever conclusions we had reached might not reflect the full story, and that there were details we did not understand. His words sounded careful, like someone walking across thin ice while hoping it would hold. Michael listened patiently before answering. He did not raise his voice or interrupt. Instead, he asked David a simple question about the message mentioning the beach house and the plan to arrive before sunset. The calm tone of the question made it impossible to dismiss. David hesitated again, glancing briefly toward Samantha, as if hoping she might provide an explanation that he could support. Samantha remained silent for a moment before speaking quietly. She admitted that she had not expected the evening to unfold this way, and that she understood why both of us were standing there. Her voice carried a trace of fatigue now, the kind that appears when someone realizes that maintaining a complicated story is no longer possible. David shifted his weight again and looked back toward me. He asked when I had discovered the messages and whether I had been planning this meeting from the beginning. I answered honestly, explaining that the discovery had happened only a few days earlier and that the decision to come to the beach house had felt like the most straightforward way to address what I had seen. Sometimes clarity requires nothing more dramatic than showing up at the right moment. The explanation seemed to settle heavily in the room. Outside the windows, the ocean reflected the pale glow of the rising moon, turning the water into a long silver path stretching toward the horizon. Michael stepped slightly closer to the center of the room and folded his arms loosely, still maintaining the same steady calm that had defined his reactions since arriving. He said that he had spent most of the drive to the coast thinking about what he might say if this moment actually happened. In the end, he had realized that there was very little to say beyond acknowledging the truth. Samantha listened quietly, her gaze dropping toward the floor for a moment before lifting again. David seemed less certain how to respond. He looked around the room slowly, as if trying to reconnect the familiar surroundings of the beach house with the unexpected reality now unfolding inside it. For years he had spoken about this place as a peaceful retreat from everyday complications. Tonight that sense of peace still existed, but it carried a different meaning. Instead of hiding secrets, the house had quietly become the place where those secrets ended. After another long pause, David finally sat down in the chair opposite the sofa, his posture reflecting the weight of the situation more clearly than his words ever had. He said that he understood why we felt hurt and confused, and that he wished things had unfolded differently. It was not quite an apology, but it was the closest he seemed able to come in that moment. Samantha nodded slightly beside him, clearly aware that the evening had reached a point where explanations would not change the basic facts of what had happened. Michael listened without interrupting, and then spoke again in the same calm voice. He said that the purpose of coming here had not been to argue or accuse anyone loudly. It had simply been to see the truth in the open so that everyone involved could decide what came next without uncertainty. His words carried a quiet sense of finality. I looked around the room once more, noticing how the familiar furniture and ocean view had taken on a different meaning over the past few hours. This place had always represented clarity and calm for me, and in a strange way it still did. The truth had arrived here quietly, without shouting or chaos, just as the waves continued to arrive steadily along the shore outside. As the night grew deeper and the lamp beside the sofa illuminated the center of the room, it became clear that none of us could return to the assumptions that had existed before this evening began. The beach house was no longer the setting for a secret weekend. It had become the place where 4 people finally saw their lives exactly as they were. The night air drifting through the open windows carried the steady sound of waves rolling onto the shore, and for a long moment no one in the room spoke. The beach house felt almost suspended in time, as if the world outside continued moving while the 4 of us remained inside a quiet pause that none of us had expected to experience. David sat in the chair across from me with his hands loosely clasped together, his shoulders slightly lowered in a way that suggested the weight of the situation had finally settled in. Samantha remained near the entryway, no longer trying to appear confident or composed, but instead looking thoughtful in the way people often do when they realize that the story they have been telling themselves can no longer continue. Michael stood near the window where the soft silver glow of moonlight reflected across the water outside. The calmness in his expression had not changed since the moment David and Samantha walked through the door, and that quiet composure seemed to influence the entire atmosphere of the room. Eventually David spoke again, though his voice sounded slower now, as if each word required more consideration than before. He said that he understood the situation looked exactly the way it appeared, but that he hoped there might still be a chance to explain the choices that had led him here. His words were careful, measured, and uncertain, the way someone might speak when they are aware that every sentence must carry the weight of honesty. I listened without interrupting, noticing how different his tone sounded from the confident voice he used at home earlier that week when he described his imaginary trip to Chicago. There was no trace of that certainty now. Michael turned slightly from the window and asked David what kind of explanation he believed could change the reality of what had already happened. The question was not harsh or accusing. It was simply direct. David opened his mouth as if preparing to answer, but then paused again, clearly recognizing that the truth required more than a quick response. Samantha looked toward him briefly before speaking herself. She said, quietly, that perhaps explanations were not the most important part of the evening anymore. Her voice carried a softness that had not been present earlier, and for the first time, she seemed to be addressing the situation without trying to shape it into something more comfortable. She looked toward Michael, and said that she knew he had come here for clarity and that he deserved to have it. Michael nodded slowly, acknowledging her words with the same calm steadiness he had maintained throughout the evening. The quiet honesty in that moment shifted the atmosphere slightly. The tension that had filled the room earlier did not disappear completely, but it softened into something more reflective. David leaned back in his chair and ran a hand across his forehead, as if organizing thoughts that had been scattered by the unexpected encounter. He said that over the past year his life had begun to feel different from what he once imagined it would be. Work had become routine, responsibilities had grown heavier, and somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that small secrets might make things easier. He admitted that the idea was foolish now that he saw the consequences clearly. His words sounded less like an excuse and more like the realization of someone who had spent too much time avoiding an honest conversation with himself. I watched him quietly while he spoke, noticing how the house around us remained completely peaceful despite the difficult truths filling the room. The same ocean breeze that had always made this place feel calm continued drifting through the windows, carrying the scent of salt and sea grass from the dark shoreline beyond the dunes. When David finished speaking, no one responded immediately. The silence that followed was not hostile. It felt more like a moment of reflection where each person considered what the next step might look like. Samantha eventually walked a few steps farther into the room and sat on the edge of the sofa across from Michael. Her posture was relaxed in a tired way, as though she understood that the evening had reached a point where honesty mattered more than appearances. She said that she regretted allowing the situation to develop the way it had, and that she wished she had addressed the problems in her own marriage long before things reached this moment. Michael listened carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. After she finished speaking, he looked toward both of them and said that while the evening had revealed something painful, it had also removed the uncertainty that had surrounded the past few days. Sometimes the truth arrives in uncomfortable ways, but once it appears, it allows people to move forward without pretending that everything is normal. His words carried a quiet clarity that seemed to resonate with all of us. I glanced around the living room again, noticing how the small lamp beside the sofa illuminated the familiar walls and photographs that had once represented ordinary weekend memories. Now the same room held a very different kind of memory, one built not on secrecy, but on the moment when those secrets finally ended. Outside, the moon had risen higher above the ocean, its light reflecting across the water like a long silver path leading into the distance. For years this beach house had been a place where David and I came to escape the noise of daily life. Tonight it had become something else entirely. It had become the place where four people finally stopped pretending and faced the truth that had been quietly waiting for them all along. The quiet reflection that settled over the living room did not erase the reality of what had brought us all here. It only made the truth clearer. The ocean outside continued its steady rhythm as if the world beyond the dunes remained completely untouched by the complicated moment unfolding inside the beach house. For several minutes, no one spoke again, and the silence allowed each of us to sit with the weight of what had been revealed. David leaned forward in the chair across from me, resting his elbows on his knees as he looked down at the wooden floor. The posture made him appear older than he had earlier that week when he confidently described his imaginary business trip. Samantha remained seated on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her attention drifting occasionally toward the window where the moonlight shimmered across the ocean. Michael stood quietly near the window frame with his arms crossed in a thoughtful way, not defensive but contemplative. Eventually David broke the silence again. His voice sounded softer now, stripped of the confidence he once carried into every conversation. He admitted that when he first began spending time with Samantha, he convinced himself it was harmless, something temporary that would never interfere with the life he had built over the past 2 decades. But over time the situation had become more complicated, and instead of facing it honestly, he had continued telling small lies that gradually formed a much larger one. The words came slowly, and even as he spoke it was clear that the explanation was less about convincing us and more about finally admitting something he had avoided acknowledging himself. Samantha listened quietly while he spoke. When he finished, she nodded once as if recognizing the same pattern in her own choices. She explained that she had allowed the excitement of secrecy to distract her from the reality of her own marriage. She said that Michael had always been steady and dependable, and that she now realized she had taken that stability for granted instead of appreciating it. Her voice remained calm, but there was a sincerity in it that had not appeared earlier in the evening. Michael listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he looked toward her for a moment before answering in the same composed tone he had maintained all night. He said that what disappointed him most was not the existence of a mistake, but the decision to hide it instead of addressing the problems in their marriage directly. Trust, he explained, is something that quietly supports every ordinary day in a relationship, and once that foundation is shaken, it becomes very difficult to pretend everything is normal again. His words were not spoken with anger. They carried the quiet clarity of someone who had already begun to accept that the future might look very different from what he once imagined. I listened to the conversation carefully, noticing how the mood in the room had shifted from shock to reflection. Earlier that evening, the truth had entered the house like a sudden storm, but now the atmosphere felt calmer, almost thoughtful, as if each person had begun examining the path that had led them here. David eventually looked toward me again. His expression carried a mixture of regret and uncertainty, the kind that appears when someone realizes that the consequences of their choices have reached a point where apologies alone cannot repair everything. He said that he wished he had spoken honestly about the distance that had grown between us long before it turned into secrecy. He admitted that he had convinced himself that maintaining the appearance of a stable life was easier than confronting uncomfortable changes. I considered his words carefully before responding. I told him that honesty might have been difficult at the time, but it would have given us both the chance to address the reality of our marriage instead of discovering it through hidden messages and secret plans. My voice remained calm, not accusatory, simply acknowledging the difference between truth and avoidance. Samantha glanced toward the window again, where the moonlight illuminated the dark stretch of ocean beyond the dunes. She said quietly that the strange part of the evening was how peaceful the setting felt despite the difficult conversation happening inside the house. Michael nodded slightly and agreed that the calmness of the place seemed to remind all of us that life continues moving forward no matter how complicated a moment might feel. The steady sound of waves outside reinforced that idea. Time did not pause simply because four people were confronting uncomfortable truths. After another long pause, David slowly stood up from the chair and walked a few steps toward the window, stopping near Michael. For a moment, both men looked out at the ocean in silence. The silver reflection of moonlight stretched across the water like a quiet path leading into the distance. David finally spoke again, this time not trying to explain the past, but acknowledging that whatever came next would require difficult decisions from everyone involved. Michael responded by saying that clarity, even when painful, allows people to begin making those decisions with honesty instead of confusion. I remained seated on the sofa, observing the scene with a sense of calm that surprised even me. The evening had not unfolded with shouting or chaos. Instead, it had revealed the truth slowly, the way the tide reveals the shape of the shoreline as the water pulls back. The beach house that once held quiet weekend memories now held something different. It held the moment when the hidden parts of four lives finally stepped into the open, leaving each of us to decide what the next chapter would look like beyond the sound of the waves. The ocean outside the beach house continued its steady rhythm as the four of us stood in the quiet living room, each person slowly accepting that the evening had changed the direction of our lives in ways none of us had planned. The silver reflection of moonlight stretched across the water beyond the dunes, and the peaceful sound of waves made the conversation inside the house feel strangely calm despite the difficult truths that had been spoken. David remained near the window beside Michael for a moment longer, both men looking out toward the ocean as if the wide horizon offered space for the thoughts they were trying to organize. Finally, David turned back toward the room and spoke again, his voice quieter than it had been earlier in the evening. He said that standing here now made him realize how much time he had spent avoiding the reality of what had been happening in his life. Instead of addressing the growing distance in our marriage, he had convinced himself that temporary distractions could somehow exist without consequences. The admission did not sound like an excuse. It sounded more like the recognition of a mistake that had become impossible to ignore. Samantha listened from the edge of the sofa, her posture relaxed but reflective. When David finished speaking, She added that secrecy often creates the illusion that a situation is less serious than it truly is. She explained that meeting quietly and keeping conversations hidden had allowed both of them to pretend the choices they were making would never affect anyone else. But standing here now with all four of us in the same room removed that illusion completely. Michael stepped away from the window and walked slowly toward the center of the living room, his expression still thoughtful but steady. He said that one of the most difficult parts of discovering something like this is realizing how easily ordinary routines can hide important truths. A person might go to work, share meals, and talk about everyday plans without noticing that something meaningful has already begun to change beneath the surface. His voice carried a quiet clarity that seemed to resonate with everyone listening. I watched the conversation unfold from the sofa, feeling a calm awareness settle over me that the hardest moment of the evening had already passed. The shock of discovery had faded, replaced by the clearer understanding that honesty, even when uncomfortable, allows people to move forward instead of remaining trapped in uncertainty. David eventually sat down again in the chair across from me, his shoulders less tense than they had been earlier, but still weighed down by the reality of the situation. He looked toward me and said that he understood the trust between us had been damaged in a way that could not simply be repaired with a conversation. He admitted that whatever happened next would require patience, honesty, and time to determine whether the life we had built together could continue in any meaningful way. I considered his words carefully before responding. I told him that discovering the truth in this way had changed my perspective more than I expected. The beach house had always been a place where I came to think clearly and reconnect with what mattered most in my life. Standing here tonight, I realized that clarity does not always arrive gently. Sometimes it appears suddenly, forcing people to examine parts of their lives they might otherwise avoid. Samantha nodded slightly, as if she understood exactly what I meant. She looked toward Michael and said that she regretted not having an honest conversation about the difficulties in their marriage long before things reached this point. Instead of confronting those problems directly, she had allowed herself to drift into something that created even greater complications. Michael listened carefully and then responded with the same calm honesty that had guided him through the entire evening. He said that relationships are built on countless small moments of trust, and when that trust is damaged, the path forward becomes uncertain for both people involved. However, he also acknowledged that understanding the truth clearly is always the first step toward deciding what comes next. His words did not carry anger. Instead, they reflected the thoughtful perspective of someone who had already begun to accept that life sometimes moves in directions no one anticipates. Outside the windows, the ocean breeze shifted slightly, rustling the tall grasses near the dunes and carrying the cool scent of salt through the open house. The peaceful setting felt almost symbolic now. The beach had always reminded me that tides move in cycles, revealing and concealing the shoreline again and again. Tonight the tide had pulled back completely, exposing the truth that had been hidden beneath everyday routines and quiet assumptions. David looked around the living room slowly, taking in the familiar furniture, the photographs on the wall, and the soft glow of the lamp beside the sofa. This house had once been a place where he and I escaped the noise of daily life. Now it had become the place where the silence of that life had finally been broken. After a moment, he stood again and walked toward the porch door, opening it slightly so the sound of the ocean grew louder inside the room. The cool night air flowed through the house, carrying with it the steady reminder that time continues moving forward no matter how complicated a moment might feel. Michael stepped beside him and looked out toward the dark horizon where the moonlight shimmered across the waves. Samantha remained seated on the sofa while I stayed in my place across from her, both of us watching the scene quietly. None of us knew exactly what decisions the coming weeks or months might bring, but one thing had become clear inside the beach house that night. The truth that had once existed only in hidden messages and secret plans now stood openly in the center of the room, leaving each of us with the responsibility of deciding what kind of future we were willing to build after the silence had finally been broken. The sound of the ocean filled the quiet spaces of the beach house as the door to the porch remained slightly open, allowing the cool night air to drift through the living room. For a long moment, none of us spoke, and the silence did not feel hostile or tense anymore. Instead, it felt reflective, like the pause people take after realizing that something important has ended and something new has quietly begun. I watched David standing near the doorway beside Michael, both men looking out toward the water where the moonlight stretched across the dark surface of the ocean. The steady rhythm of the waves seemed to slow everything down, giving each of us time to think about what had happened and what it meant for the lives we had been living only a few hours earlier. Eventually, David stepped away from the door and returned to the center of the room. He looked older somehow than he had that morning, not physically, but in the way his expression carried a deeper awareness. He spoke calmly and said that tonight had forced him to confront something he had been avoiding for a long time. He explained that he had convinced himself that problems in a marriage could be ignored if daily life continued to function on the surface. Work schedules, errands, dinners with friends, and routine conversations had created the appearance that everything was normal even though something essential had already begun to slip away. Hearing him speak so honestly surprised me, not because the words were dramatic, but because they felt sincere in a way our conversations had not felt for many months. Samantha shifted slightly on the sofa and rested her hands together while she listened. When David finished speaking, she looked toward me with a thoughtful expression and said that she understood now how easily people can lose direction when communication slowly fades. She explained that when two people stop sharing their real thoughts and concerns, even small misunderstandings can grow into larger distances that feel difficult to cross. She admitted that instead of trying to repair that distance with Michael, she had chosen a path that only made everything more complicated. Michael remained calm as he listened, his posture relaxed but attentive. He walked slowly across the room and leaned lightly against the back of the armchair before speaking. His voice was steady and thoughtful, the same tone he had carried throughout the entire evening. He said that sometimes the most painful discoveries also create the clearest moments of understanding. When something hidden finally becomes visible, it removes the uncertainty that often causes the most confusion in relationships. He explained that while the truth might not always bring immediate solutions, it does allow people to move forward with clarity instead of continuing to question what might be happening behind closed doors. I listened carefully to each of them, while feeling the strange calm that had slowly replaced the earlier shock of the evening. The beach house had always been a place where I came to think, and tonight it seemed to be doing exactly that for all of us. The familiar rooms, the quiet sound of the ocean, and the gentle breeze moving through the open door created an atmosphere that encouraged honesty instead of confrontation. David looked toward me again and said that he knew the future between us could not be decided in a single night. He acknowledged that rebuilding trust is not something that happens quickly or easily, and he said he would respect whatever time or space I needed to think about what I truly wanted moving forward. His voice carried a seriousness that suggested he understood the weight of those words. I took a moment before responding because I wanted to speak carefully and honestly. I told him that tonight had changed the way I looked at many things in my life. For a long time I had sensed that something between us was different, but I had not fully understood why. Now that the truth was clear, the uncertainty that once troubled my thoughts had finally disappeared. I explained that clarity does not always make decisions easier, but it does make them more honest. Samantha listened quietly and then turned toward Michael. She spoke softly and said that she regretted allowing distance and silence to shape their relationship instead of addressing their concerns directly when they first appeared. She said that she understood if Michael needed time to consider what he wanted for his future, just as David and I would need time to decide what direction our lives might take after this night. Michael nodded slowly, acknowledging her words without rushing to offer a conclusion. He said that life rarely follows the plans people create when they first build a relationship. Over time, priorities change, perspectives shift, and sometimes individuals grow in different directions. However, he also believed that moments like this provide an opportunity to reflect honestly on what truly matters instead of simply continuing old routines out of habit. Outside the beach house, the waves rolled steadily against the shore, their rhythm unchanged by the complicated conversation happening inside the quiet living room. The night felt wide and open beyond the windows, stretching far beyond the narrow concerns that had filled our thoughts earlier in the evening. David stepped onto the porch for a moment, breathing in the cool air before looking back toward us inside the house. The soft glow from the living room lights framed the doorway as he spoke again, saying that no matter what decisions followed tonight, He was grateful that the truth had finally been spoken openly instead of remaining hidden in silence. I stood slowly and walked toward the doorway as well, pausing beside him where the ocean breeze touched my face. From the porch the shoreline looked peaceful, the moon reflecting across the water like a long silver path stretching into the distance. It reminded me that every ending also marks the beginning of something else, even if that new direction is not immediately clear. Behind us, Michael and Samantha remained inside the living room, quietly talking with the calm voices of people who understood that the next chapter of their lives would require reflection and patience. Standing there on the porch beside the steady sound of the waves, I realized that the evening had not simply revealed a hidden truth. It had created a moment where each of us now faced the same question about the future we wanted to build once the silence that once surrounded our lives had finally been broken. The ocean breeze continued to move gently across the porch as I stood beside David, both of us looking out at the quiet shoreline where the waves rolled steadily under the silver light of the moon. For several minutes neither of us spoke, and the silence felt thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. Inside the beach house, the soft murmur of Michael and Samantha, talking quietly in the living room, drifted through the open doorway behind us. It felt strange to realize that only a few hours earlier none of us had expected this night to unfold the way it did. The plan had once been simple. David thought he was coming here for a secret weekend escape. Samantha believed she would arrive quietly and leave without anyone else ever knowing. Instead, the four of us now stood in the same house, no longer hiding anything from one another. I leaned lightly against the wooden railing of the porch and looked toward the long stretch of sand that disappeared into the darkness beyond the dunes. This beach house had always been a peaceful place for me. Over the years I had come here during summer weekends, quiet holidays, and moments when I needed time to think clearly. Tonight the house had given me something unexpected but valuable. It had given me the truth. David finally spoke, his voice calm but thoughtful as he looked out toward the water. He said that standing here made him realize how easily people can drift away from the life they once promised to protect. It does not usually happen in one dramatic moment. Instead, it happens through small choices, quiet assumptions, and the belief that certain problems can wait until later. He admitted that he had spent too long believing that later would somehow fix everything. I listened carefully before answering. I told him that the hardest part of tonight had not been discovering the truth. The hardest part had been realizing how long we had both sensed that something in our marriage was changing without truly addressing it. When people avoid honest conversations, silence slowly becomes part of the relationship. Eventually, that silence grows wide enough that two people begin living separate emotional lives even while sharing the same home. David nodded slowly, understanding exactly what I meant. Behind us, the porch door opened, and Michael stepped outside, gently closing the door so Samantha could remain inside for a moment. He joined us at the railing and looked out toward the horizon where the moonlight touched the ocean. His presence carried the same calm perspective he had shown throughout the evening. He said that the strange thing about life is that clarity often arrives during the moments people least expect. No one plans for a night like this. Yet sometimes the truth reveals itself in a way that forces everyone involved to pause and reconsider what they truly want from the future. David turned slightly toward Michael and thanked him for the way he had handled the entire situation. He said that the evening could have easily become something filled with anger and accusations, but instead it had become a moment of reflection for all of us. Michael responded with a thoughtful smile and said that reacting with anger rarely creates solutions. Understanding what happened and why it happened provides a much stronger foundation for whatever decisions come next. A few moments later, Samantha stepped onto the porch as well, wrapping a light sweater around her shoulders as the cool night air moved across the beach. She looked at each of us before speaking, her voice quiet but sincere. She said that tonight had shown her something important about honesty and responsibility. Avoiding difficult conversations might feel easier in the moment, but eventually those avoided truths return in ways that are much harder to face. She admitted that she wished she had recognized that earlier. The four of us stood together along the porch railing, looking out toward the steady movement of the waves. The night had grown deeper, and the stars above the ocean were bright and clear. For the first time since the evening began, I felt a genuine sense of peace settling over my thoughts. The situation had been painful, yes, but it had also removed the uncertainty that once lived quietly in the background of my life. Now everything was visible, and that visibility made it possible to move forward honestly. I took a slow breath of the cool salt air and spoke to the group. I said that none of us needed to decide the future tonight. Life is not a story that ends in a single conversation. Real change takes time, reflection, and the willingness to grow beyond the mistakes people make along the way. What mattered most was that we had faced the truth directly instead of continuing to live inside assumptions and silence. Michael agreed and said that tomorrow would simply be another day, one that offered each of us the opportunity to think carefully about what kind of life we wanted to build next. Samantha nodded quietly, understanding that the road ahead would require patience and honest effort. David looked out at the ocean one more time before turning back toward me. His expression carried a mixture of regret and determination, as if he understood that the future depended on the choices he would make after this night. I looked back toward the beach and watched the waves roll gently against the shore. The tide was slowly rising again, covering the sand that had been exposed earlier in the evening. It reminded me that life, like the ocean, moves in cycles of change. Some moments reveal hidden truths, while others offer the chance to begin again with greater wisdom. Standing there on the porch of the beach house with the quiet sound of the waves surrounding us, I realized that the night had not been about revenge or confrontation. It had been about clarity. The secret that once threatened to break our lives apart had instead brought everything into the open, giving each of us the rare opportunity to decide our future with honesty instead of illusion. And as the moonlight stretched across the water and the wind carried the steady rhythm of the ocean through the air, I understood something with complete certainty. No matter what paths we each chose after leaving this beach house, the truth we discovered here would shape the next chapter of our lives in ways none of us would ever forget.